Hey guys, this video is to some extent about veganism, vegan politics, animal rights, human rights, those concepts and how we use them in vegan politics. But it's also about the issue of belief itself. I got some intelligent questions, responses, and reactions to my recent video saying that I do not believe in animal rights. And some of them may or may not have gotten the message that in a more recent video, I think uploaded a day or two later, I also clarified that in a very real sense, I do not believe in human rights. If we're talking about it as a matter of belief, no, that's not something I believe in. It doesn't mean the concept is completely meaningless. And I put in some caveats and counterexamples in that self-same video explaining my position on human rights. But I'll show this intersects with practical everyday questions of how we organize vegan activism. I had a message in response to me sent back saying, more or less, this is a paraphrase, more or less quoting, if humans have human rights, why would animals not have animal rights? Thus saying I'm using a double standard or perhaps guilty of speciesism or what have you. Now, from my perspective, that question is just as absurd as saying, if humans have poetry, why do animals not have poetry? So my claim here is not that human rights don't exist in some absolute ontological sense. I also would not claim that poetry doesn't exist. However, clearly when we're talking about poetry, we're talking about something creative and abstract, something that's deeply couched in cultural and aesthetic considerations. Whether or not something is poetry. I mean, I can show you a poem translated from medieval Japanese into English, modern English, and you may ask yourself, is this poetry? I can show you Sanskrit poetry translated into English, and you may wonder, is this poetry? And I can show you even poetry, 20th century poetry written in English in California in the 1960s, and you may ask yourself, is this poetry? Whether or not something is poetry, whether or not you can recognize it as poetry, whether or not you can appreciate or enjoy it as poetry, gets into a lot of tricky questions that are not based in a strict and simple sense on belief, right? But if you ask me, do animals have poetry? My answer is no. Poetry is part of human society, and we may write poems for or about animals. We may project poetic qualities onto animals in our works of art. We may, depict them in a poetic way. We may, in a sense, have animal poetry within human culture. But this is, so to speak, a set of abstract and largely aesthetic values human beings have created. And likewise, when we talk about rights, human rights, partly what we're talking about is a very simple legal idea. I mentioned that in the earlier video. Do you or do you not have the right to drink alcohol in a public park? In some countries you do, and some you don't. So that's the difference between England and Canada. Do you or do you not have the right to drive a car under these circumstances? Those circumstances, it's different for choices. Partly it's a very simple, cut and dry legal issue. But we all know to a large extent the reason why people get so emotional reason why people get so passionate about human rights is that it also gets into this realm of aesthetic, poetic, and indeed ultimately ethical issues. This is why people become so animated about rights, and why some people find it convincing or moving to state the case for veganism in terms of animal rights or in terms of human rights, trying to say this is an extension of the anti-slavery crusade, the peace crusade, what have you. There's a quotation from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan that comes to mind. Hobbes says laconically and in passing that these social conventions, things like human rights, human rights discourse didn't really exist during his lifetime, but these barriers that define society, they remain in place due to the danger, though not the difficulty, of breaking them. And that's the other brutal reality of human rights, animal rights, or what have you. To a large extent, peace exists in the shadow of war, and discourse in polite society is, to some extent, created, vitiated, and backed up by the threat of violence. It's by enforcement, ultimately, that questions of human rights become so important. Are you or are you not going to go to a local city park and prevent someone from drinking alcohol there? If there's no enforcement, if you have a law, either that people can drink alcohol in a public park, that it's a civil right, it's a human right, or that they cannot, one way or another, this comes down to matters of enforcement. And there also, I have to say, if you ask the question this way, do animals have animal rights in the same sense that humans have human rights? No, they don't, because animals cannot enforce animal rights. Animals are precisely reliant on humans to imagine and project these values, project them onto animals, and for humans to then enforce these rights against one another. So again, this is a unique asymmetry, and many people, including Tobias Leonhardt in his new book, which I'm going to do another review on, maybe talk to Tobias also, invited him to do a kind of conversation or debate with me about it. These are issues that other people in the animal rights movement or vegan movement recognize also, that this is fundamentally different from a situation like the liberation of slaves, where we can ask the slaves themselves to determine their own rights and interests and take on these responsibilities, where instead we're talking about a situation of perpetual dependency, perpetual inequality. Even if you want to declare that all animals are equal to humans, which some vegans want to do, there's a perpetual inequality because their rights are in fact our rights projected onto them, created, imagined, and enforced by human beings and human values. So for me, a profoundly related issue here comes up from my watching a new video from Vegan Gains. I think it is very easy for people to imagine that if only we had a society in which everyone mouthed these principles, in which everyone either believed or recited these pious, hallowed principles, we'd have a profoundly more compassionate society, a profoundly less violent society. So my point here is, I do not believe in animal rights. I do not believe in human rights. And I think some of the people who support and propound these notions, they themselves also do not believe them. And yet they believe that the world would be a better place, our society would be a better society, if only everyone around them would pretend, would recite and pretend they believe in these principles, that we would have a less and less violent society, less and less violent of man against man, of human beings against animals, and so on. I describe my own philosophy as nihilism, but specifically as historical nihilism. I'm really interested in learning the lessons of history, and what that means to me is different than what it means to someone who's an ideologue. If you believe this, I would urge you to spend some time studying the historical reality of Theravada Buddhist societies, whether you are looking at medieval Sri Lanka or medieval Thailand. These are societies, historically, that are in many ways more appealing than a medieval Christian society or a medieval Muslim society. It is no doubt true that in many, many ways, living in medieval Sri Lanka or medieval Thailand would be more pleasant than living in medieval Saudi Arabia or even medieval Germany, medieval France, right? Let's set that aside. However, it is very significant that in a society, in a traditional Theravada Buddhist society, where people would literally mouth the words of nonviolence and compassion day after day, year after year, in which chanting these principles and believing in these principles was a daily feature of society. It was a cornerstone and bedrock of the religion, public religion, popular religion, and also the religion of state. Nevertheless, these were societies based on torture of human beings, exploitation of animals, and slavery. Very real slave trade. And it is very different from the history of slavery in the United States of America, but nevertheless, slavery is slavery, and involved also whipping and torturing slaves. But these are societies that preached compassion to such a remarkable extent. And yet, in Sri Lanka, for example, crowds were delighted by watching someone being tortured to death, with an elephant, having a human being riding on an elephant, crushing a human being to death, and then the elephant tearing the person apart, and so on. This was not only a form of torture and execution, but indeed public entertainment in the midst of the society. Medieval Cambodia, or pre-modern Cambodia, again, profoundly Buddhist society, and yet they had their equivalent of gladiator games, of men killing each other in public martial arts combat, fighting each other, and crowds would show up and cheer. And the parents of the young men, who would be seriously maimed and sometimes killed, seriously injured and sometimes killed in these, public martial arts displays, seeing no problem with it. And again, needless to say, all of these societies, the whole society ate meat, including the Buddhist monks who preach these virtues of nonviolence and compassion. So I do not believe in animal rights. I do not believe in human rights. I do not believe in the efficacy of belief itself. Ultimately, that's the point of nihilism from my perspective, is the critique of belief as such, the rejection of belief. And I think we can learn a lot from looking analytically, sympathetically, but analytically, at the real differences between historical societies that have preached these beliefs. And please, I mean, within living memory, you had communist societies that piously preached, that piously believed in so many virtues about human rights. I mean, has there ever been another society more fanatically devout in its belief and espousal of human rights than the Soviet Union, than Russia, the whole Soviet-aligned Russian bloc? And yet, what really were human rights in that society? Has there ever been another society more devoutly and more fanatically obsessed with the rights of workers, of labor unions? And yet we all know in a very real sense the Soviet Union workers had no rights, especially not the right to unionize. Neither did they have those rights in communist China, even communist, smaller communist countries scattered here and there around the world. Okay? There is a profound lesson for us to learn that's directly applicable to vegan politics in those cases, and there's a profound lesson for us to learn about belief itself and ideology.